Hello, this is Ray from R&R Golf in Quincy, Illinois, and this is brand new golf balls, the 2014 Srixon Marathons. Normally they're $15.99. Now you can buy 2 dozen, 2 for $25 here at R&R.
You'll also find on the last page some resources. So I hope you learned some things tonight, and maybe you'll be skeptical about a few things, but I hope if you want to learn more, you'll check some of these resources. The first one is the official website of the Illinois government. There you can find the law itself, the regulations, which are still being molded, and you can sign up for important updates. It's still possible to leave criticism or praise of the regulations if you wish. One of the items on that list is called the Pot Book, and I really recommend this book for a number of reasons. It was helpful to me in understanding the various types of cannabis medicine and the conditions for which they may be effective. There's also a lot of information about the cultural significance of cannabis throughout history and throughout various societies. It's only been illegal in this country for 80 years. It has served many purposes throughout human history. And that book does a very good job of demonstrating that. Some of the other 2 items on the resources are industry publications. Medical marijuana is actually a very sophisticated industry in various other states. And if it's something you're looking at as an investment opportunity or a career prospect, you can sign up for daily updates and you can keep pulse of it and make more informed decisions. And the final item is a publication that is published by the Denver Post, because this industry is such a big thing in Denver. So, one of the things I hope you come to learn is that this law may just be a very good fit for Illinois. In August, after it was enacted, there was a industry trade show in Chicago, and one of the speakers there was Representative Lou Lang, who was the chief sponsor of the bill. And what he said was that this bill passed by just the minimum number of votes. It was not possible to enact a bill that was any less restrictive, because he wouldn't have been able to get any more votes. So in that sense, I think this is the perfect fit. Anything more or less would not have passed. He also said this is really about the patients. It's about improving quality of life for people who suffer from these conditions. In America, we should not be keeping people from their medicine, is an opinion of mine. And one of the other great benefits to the law potentially is the economic opportunity. Ultimately, I think we need to ask when a law is enacted, why pass a law? And I think the answer is if the benefits outweigh the costs. In this case, I see the benefits as improved quality of life for patients and economic opportunity. But there are significant costs. We're talking about a psychoactive substance. So to the degree that it impairs people and they go out in public and they make costly mistakes, that's bad for society. But the law recognizes that, and it takes some steps to mitigate those costs. For example, in the employer-employee context, employers are giving important safeguards to prevent themselves from becoming liable against patients who would go to work impaired. And we have a local attorney who's going to talk about some of those issues. So talking about the economic opportunity, I suppose it is now the appropriate time to introduce myself. My name is Bradley Valerius. I'm a licensed attorney in Illinois. I'm originally from Benelde, which is located halfway between St. Louis and Springfield. It's very rural. My mother was a school teacher. My father worked at a power plant. I graduated from a public school class of 80-something. I went to college in St. Louis for several years. I worked as a journalist in the remote gaming industry, the global remote gaming industry. which is somewhat similar to cannabis because you have many small jurisdictions which each have their own laws, but it becomes problematic when you deal with how those jurisdictions interact with each other. I went to law school in 2008 because I wanted to improve myself and my career in a way that I could make a better difference for society and also to improve my own life so that I would have more economic opportunity. I graduated into a hard economy. I floundered for a while. I was practicing law as a solo attorney in August when this law passed. And I read it and I was blown away by the prospective opportunity, particularly for central and southern Illinois. The reason why is because this law requires the growers and the sellers to be somewhat evenly distributed throughout the state. It's not as though they're all going to be clustered around the population center of Chicago. We could have some here. We could have some throughout the entire state. And when I read it, I envisioned that this industry could rejuvenate our state in some ways because I've come from a rural area that could really use a little bit of stimulation. So for me personally, I imagined I could set myself up as one of the first people who is really knowledgeable and articulate about this issue to be able to educate others and to be able to find work. So with that, I'm going to start going down this outline, which you'll find in the program. I already mentioned I think it's important to consider if the benefits outweigh the costs. And another thing I think is important is what do the people want? I read a lot of headlines every day and I see public opinion polls. And it seems that an increasing amount of Americans want to see this liberalized. Do any of our panelists have anything to say about that? Okay. Another question I think is important is what is the American way? I'm here in Quincy where I know the Lincoln and Douglas debates took place, and there's a lot of history here, but for many, when those debates took place, cannabis wasn't illegal. It wasn't until the 1930s that cannabis was made illegal, and I'm not here to talk about the circumstances why it was made illegal, but I think it's something you all might want to research on your own. Yeah.
Some of what I did a couple of different outreaches, and I think some of what I hear from the public mostly opportunity to communities as they interact with as far as jobs, as far as and I understand that the growing facilities that the state will capture 7% tax on that, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That is a matter of law. Cultivation centers are taxed at 7% of their sales to the dispensary.
And that the dispensaries have sell-finished product a month would generate from 20 to 40 jobs.
Okay, well, first, I think the cultivation center is probably going to create about 20 to 30 jobs. Those are people who are going to work there directly at the cultivation center. But there's going to be I would think dispensaries will be about 10 to 20, but let me, I'll touch all of that here. So I think the cultivation center is going to create around 30 jobs. And those are people who are going to be working full-time at the facility, but you also have a lot of opportunity for contractors and service providers to build the facility, to provide security, to make sure everything is compliant with the law and regulations. And you'll also have a lot of products and services providers. For the dispensaries, I think the figure is more like 10 to 20 jobs. Ethan, would you like to address some of the economic impact issues?
Yeah, my name is Ethan Ben. Among other things, I spent time in Denver, Colorado, and California. The emerging industries in all these states. Am I loud enough or is Hi. So my name is Ethan Fampe. I'm fortunate to have spent a good amount of time in the medical states of California, Oregon, and Washington. And I've also spent some time working in the industry in Colorado and Denver under my close friend here, Joe Tremolata, who's in the audience. Denver particularly is an interesting case. You had, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but in 2009, 2010, they passed 1284, which allowed for the regulated controlled sale of marijuana dispensaries. That allowed an immediate expansion of the industry, which people would put up large warehouses for production, large greenhouses. You saw an expansion in the economies of the ancillary industries, and especially service providers, HVAC, electrical, any kind of any kind of mechanical or construction need that these facilities had, and also because you had accountants provide services, attorneys. You've really seen a boom in the infused and extracted products industry. So that seems to be more scientific, more sophisticated than perhaps other parts of the industries in terms of that's where a lot of the science is happening. You're looking at creating manufactured products, edibles, extracts that need to be scientifically tested, that need to be known quantities. You need to understand the genetic profiles of the plants and what plants are specific, what genetic strains provide specific medical benefits or have specific uses. And all of those things involve economies that involve a wide range of secondary businesses. I think the National Cannabis Industries Association, which has identified 12 business sectors that in which there's expansion opportunities. Again, everywhere from the service providers that are associated with the build out to the retail front to the accounting, the legal side, but also the I'm sorry, it's slipping my tongue here, but yeah, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a reason why Denver didn't see a recession. There's a reason why a lot of capital went to Colorado to help build this industry and really bring it out of the ground. You don't see necessarily a lot of that development in other states where you have medical laws but you don't have necessarily the tightly regulated production and distribution. Part of that is just because of legal liability. For instance, in California, I believe the medical law there does not actually allow for transportation. You can't make a profit in California. That's given rise to all kinds of weird business models. But again, not necessarily but again, anyone who's serious about expanding and getting into the industry and doing something sophisticated generally faces more liability than they're comfortable with. Which is why, again, you want this tightly regulated system that allows for companies to have known risk variables and be able to make sound business decisions.
I think that was good. Jared.
My understanding is that it takes about 48 hours for one person to process one unit of marijuana. So I would imagine that one of these ancillary businesses that might hire
Yeah, that's a good point. The processing of the harvested plant is a pretty labor-intensive process. And it's analogous to the labor-intensive process that you used to have to you had to use in the other half of marijuana, which is hemp cultivation. In Missouri, there's a lot of history in terms of the processing facilities and the labor that was necessary to process the plant. Again, there's some difference between industrial hemp processing and actual marijuana processing, but the basic idea even with marijuana is you get your harvested product, and it's a labor-intensive process to remove all the leaves and all the stuff that isn't the flowers and the bud of the plant, which is for all the cannabinoids, all the rest, and all the oil of the plant flies, and that's the valuable stuff.
Okay, the economic opportunity is definitely going to be a very stimulating conversation, but first I would like to address some of the things that may be more pertinent to the physicians and patients in the audience. So in that regard, a physician who will certify the use of medical cannabis in Illinois must be licensed under Illinois' Medical Practices Act. The physician must also have a license under the Controlled Substances Act. And a physical evaluation is necessary. A doctor can't observe the patient via some interactive means like the computer. And there also must be a genuine relationship between the doctor and the patient. The law does a good job of verifying that there is a legitimate relationship between the doctor and patient because when certifying a patient, the doctor attests to a few things. One is that there is a patient-physician relationship, that the patient does have one of these debilitating medical conditions, and that the patient is likely to benefit from cannabis. Benefit being a therapeutic or a palliative benefit. The physician has to review the patient's medical history going back at least 1 year. I wrote that incorrectly, I apologize. In the program it says 3 years, but I verified that before I came here, it's 1 year. That doesn't necessarily mean that the patient and the physician have had a relationship spanning 1 year. It means that the physician has reviewed the patient's records for a period of 1 year. There's one thing I think is really important to understand, and that's that this registration process of patients doesn't even begin until November or December, so don't rush into new relationships with new doctors. The reason there is such a delay is because getting the system right takes time. The first step is always enacting a law, but the law must always then be fine-tuned through the regulatory agencies, and this is a transparent system. The regulatory agencies first put out a set of rules, and then there's a period of time in which the public can look at these rules and they can comment on them, and when a system is working correctly, the agency will adjust those rules to fit the public. But the point is that we are months away from this process being complete, even further away from medicine entering the market. It's really going to be about a year before patients can purchase any legal medicine. So stick with your regular doctor for now, at least. A patient must be 18 to register with the health department's system. So the first step is getting that certification from the doctor. The second step is registering with the health department. And the health department's going to run a state police background investigation, and no one with drug-related felonies is going to be able to get a card. That's part of the law, not the regulation, so it's pretty static. There is a waiver that can be obtained for people who can show that their felony was for legitimate medical use. It's important to recognize that these health department regulations are still changing. However, for example, the fee amount I believe is around $100 now, but it is $50 if the person is registered with Medicare, Medicaid. And that was a change. I believe an initial draft had some other fee structure, and the health department has responded. The health department also responded by removing a restriction on people who had FOID cards. The first draft said that anyone who has a FOID card cannot also have a medical cannabis card, but that restriction has been lifted. Each patient can have one designated caregiver. I think of the caregiver as the person who can help purchase and administer cannabis to patients who are disabled. Because there are circumstances where a patient's not going to be able to get to the dispensary to purchase his own medicine. The caregiver must be 21, and the caregiver is also going to have to go through that state police background investigation and cannot have any drug-related felonies. At this point, maybe it's appropriate to talk about the interaction between state and federal law, because cannabis is still classified as a controlled substance under federal law, yet we have an Illinois law that is beginning to allow the use of that controlled substance. So one of the pertinent points is a few months ago, a Justice Department official issued a memorandum on this subject saying that in cases where the states are deciding to go forward with intrastate regulatory systems, it is the traditional province of the states themselves to enforce those laws. So it's the state enforcement agencies that should be policing cannabis rather than the federal government, is what the Justice Department is saying there. Assuming that the states are complying with 8 specific policy objectives, and those objectives are making sure that cannabis doesn't get into the hands of minors, making sure that it doesn't cross state lines, and Illinois, like Colorado, does a pretty good job of ensuring some of those things. And the Illinois law also gives some immunities to patients and physicians to relieve their worry that they may be sanctioned for participating in some of this activity. Would any other of our panelists like to address anything about the interplay of state and federal law?
So the guidance that was issued by the Department of Justice, this memo that has 8 federal priorities, is not an immunity or any kind of waiver or guarantee from the Department of Justice. It's just a policy position. And if you take them to court and you say, well, you're prosecuting us and we have complied with all these 8 guidelines, they will say, well, we enforce the law. You know, this is just a policy that determines our discretionary enforcement. So there's a couple issues here. And ultimately, and then this is important to understand because obviously this figures into the risk that any business or organization brings on when they get into this industry. But under federal law, of course, all of this is illegal. The question is, as states change their state laws, what room do they have to protect their industries and protect the stakeholders that are participating in those industries in a responsible fashion? Again, we have seen some positive signals from the Obama administration and from Congress. There is almost every year now there's legislation filed in the House of Representatives. I think there's 20-ish, 25-odd, 30-odd supporters of serious medical or legalization marijuana reform in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, there's not a single senator that advocates more than decriminalization. I think Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky is probably the person who's gone farthest in that direction in saying that we need to decriminalize marijuana on a federal level. Now, the way that the federal law works is that under the Controlled Substances Act, the Attorney General and the DEA administrator have discretion to determine what substances are on the controlled substances list. So marijuana is now currently scheduled as Schedule 1, which according to the federal government means means that it has no accepted medical value or use. Now, states obviously have said, through their, 22 states, 22 states, including Illinois, have now said, we are going to say something different. We believe that marijuana has some medical use. So we're creating this law to allow for that in our state. Now, the question is, how does the federal government enforce that law when the states are beginning to go the opposite direction? The answer has to do with, first off, the Drug Enforcement Administration only has about 5,000 or so special agents. And I think that we all understand that they have much higher priorities than enforcing domestic, state-regulated marijuana use. And I think they understand that too. I think they'd rather be seeing what they can do to push back against foreign cartels. I think the methamphetamine and heroin problems and the prescription drug abuse in America are much more serious problems to them than marijuana. That being said, the DEA is an agency, is a federal agency that pulls in about 20 to 30% of its budget through civil forfeiture, which is the law that allows it to seize property from people violating federal law, liquidate that property, and Congress actually has delegated these funds to the direct control of the Department of Justice, which is problematic in a number of ways outside of simple marijuana policy. But you can think of the DEA and any other federal agency that enforces the Controlled Substances Act as an agency that is dependent on these kind of revenue streams, where they seize property that's suspected of being involved in illegal behavior, and they use that property, usually cash, real property or whatever, to supplement their budget. So at the federal level, there's this somewhat incestuous loop or system where agencies no longer have to go necessarily to Congress for their budget, but they basically use the law as the revenue stream for part of their budget. That's important to understand because that tells you something about how the DEA is motivated when they look at enforcing these laws, and also how the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is the other player. The DEA can do whatever it wants, but the U.S. Attorney has to bring the prosecution. And that's also another important variable. The U.S. Attorney in Illinois hasn't, to my knowledge, expressed anything publicly on this issue. But again, it seems to me that as long as this industry proceeds in a responsible and a regulated fashion, and the cultivation centers and the dispensaries operate according to the federal priorities listed in the Department of Justice memo that came out a few months ago, that the U.S. Attorney should not have much reason to really go after the industry here. I saw a hand in the back.
Well, I wonder what the local or state enforcement policies or changes to what it is.
That's a good question. I suspect Brad might have, or one of the other panelists might have a better answer to that question. But again, you're talking about disentangling a system that, drug prohibition in Illinois, marijuana prohibition in Illinois is not just a state, but it's also a federal thing. And the way that the enforcement has played out is now you have a lot of federal involvement in local and state agencies. So as you move forward, it's important to have state and local law enforcement at the table as stakeholders in these discussions and in these policy changes. But there's always that issue of the feds, or right there, and understanding how that plays out, and seeing how that plays out might be different in certain jurisdictions. I don't know more than that, but maybe someone else can address that.
Excuse me. Good evening. My name is Drew Schnock. I'm a local attorney here. I presume I'm here because I do a lot of criminal defense work, which would be drug-related DUIs. I do some family law and things of that nature. When I read the act, and I have read it, I certainly haven't memorized it. I'm not that familiar with it. The thing that surprised me about it is that in reality, it really doesn't change anything. as far as the legalization of marijuana. The laws are still the same. It's still illegal to possess it. It's still illegal to manufacture or grow it. It is still illegal to distribute it unless, and that's the big unless. The unless is if you have a card or if you're a licensed caregiver or provider, if you've complied with the law. So if you've done that, if you have a debilitating injury or an illness and you qualify and you have your card and the amounts you possess are lawful, you don't have anything to worry about. If somebody's out there thinking this is going to make marijuana legal in Quincy or Adams County, which is not very liberal, they're kidding themselves. Yeah, who knew? And Riff, I think it's a great question, but the fact of the matter is the sheriff and the law enforcement agencies are here. It's not going to change their duties at all. If they catch someone who doesn't have the lawful right to possess the cannabis, they're going to arrest them and they're going to prosecute them, whether it's on a county level or a statewide level. As we all know, the current laws give a great deal of discretion for the individual officer making the arrest, depending upon the amount, the weight, the criminal history of the person he's dealing with. Can be charged as an ordinance violation, which really isn't very serious, carrying mostly monetary fines. It can be charged as a misdemeanor, or it can be charged as a felony, a very serious felony that involves forfeitures, as they've talked about, in prison time. But the first thing that came to my mind when I saw this is this isn't going to change the obligations of law enforcement. It isn't going to make anything any more legal or any less legal unless you comply with the law. If you comply with the law, you don't have any problems. If you don't comply with the law, nothing's changed.
Three real quick things on the federal issue. One is the ultra simple answer is until January 21st of 2017, the policy of the Justice Department is no matter how they feel about the substance, they're not going to interfere with internal legal usage within the boundaries of states like Illinois and Colorado. Second thing is there's been some signals sent by the United States Supreme Court that truly intrastate commerce may be on the reach of federal regulations. Now, Category 1 substance is still pretty serious, but I don't think you'll find many scientists that say that cannabis belongs in Category 1. And the last thing is in 2003, when DHS became part of, when the DEA became part of Homeland, the emphasis went to smuggling as opposed to local kingpins and dealers. And so a lawful, internally grown program is going to be a highly low priority target, even for an administration that won't make the same pledge that Attorney General Holder has made. So, I think we can have this conversation about how to comply with the Illinois law for another 3 years without any fear or hesitation.
I have one more comment on federal law. One of the issues that I don't know if it has been brought up yet, but banking. Under federal law, it's illegal for a bank to accept proceeds of any transaction that violates the Controlled Substances Act. The other issue is that the IRS doesn't allow you to deduct your ordinary business expenses from your income taxes. So as the industry proceeds, you're going to have to figure out not only how you're going to manage these cash-only businesses, essentially, but also how you're going to get Congress or the IRS to move forward on this. Again, the IRS has given a memo that outlines guidelines that make it seem like there is some wiggle room for banks to deal with legal, state licensed, regulated providers, but that memo, again, gives no certainty. It doesn't change the law. When I was in Colorado, one of the ways that companies used that I saw companies kind of getting around this was that instead of a shell company, that didn't have marijuana or cannabis in the name, and that's the bank account the paychecks came out of. But it wasn't a secure system, it wasn't a safe system. You know, anytime a bank got the idea that this account was tied to marijuana, there was a substantial likelihood that they would say, well, we have to close your account because of liability under federal law. So that's another issue that needs some attention. Sayan? Well,
I'll take the third one. You go ahead and take the first.
what was your second? So yes, you're going to have to get used to cash-only businesses and the modalities of how that works. Yeah, you can't get bank. Well, yeah, you're not going to get a bank loan. No bank's going to give you a loan on this. What was your first question? Oh, is this going to be like big tobacco? You know, that's a really, you know, that might have more to do with the dynamics of each state than anything else. That being said, I think that there are significant differences between and maybe I'm not answering your question directly. I think there's a significant difference between marijuana and in terms of its genetic variety. I don't think that there's going to be necessarily a standard mass market product in the future. There may be several, but I think there's always going to be some room for, you know, genetic experimentation, proprietary strains that you know. Now, if you're asking me to say, you know, well, only big corporations own it or only big players have access to the industry, you know, that's a granular question that has a lot to do with how the laws evolve. One of the things that my colleagues in Oregon, and as you know, I'm associated with the movement in Missouri to legalize marijuana. One of the issues that, one of the things that is foremost in our minds is we don't want to have this restrictive model where we can't attract capital from people who want to invest in our state. So, you know, there's residency requirements in Colorado and other barriers to entry in other states. You know, we want in Missouri and Oregon, or at least the people that I know that are working on legalization there, we want the barriers to not include things that keep people from coming to us and, you know, investing in capital and the things that make a state have economic activity. So I'm not sure if I can answer that question further, but
I'll try number 1 and 3 now that I've listened to the answer. The reason why I don't think you're going to see a big tobacco thing, even though it requires a pile of money to get into this. All the data in Colorado suggested that even when the banks liberalized a little bit, it was a real hurdle to entry. But the law calls for an awful lot of transparency and an awful lot of decentralization. And so it would be very difficult for a cartel type or an oligopoly type situation to arise just in Illinois compassionate cannabis. Part of it will be taxpayers and citizens being vigilant, but maintain that concern that won't happen, okay? A week ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer your last question, but I also happen to be a university professor, and one of my students wrote 50 pages on this topic, and his research is sound. And the degeneration in the reputation of cannabis is largely attributable to Hearst and his multiple publications, and including his indirect funding of Reefer Madness, or his organization's indirect funding. But the Cat 1 probably has more to do with J. Edgar Hoover originally, and some physicians that he was able to put his arms around from Johns Hopkins than it does Hearst. But the criminalization of cannabis probably doesn't happen without Hearst's passion for it, which my student couldn't explain to me. But yeah, your point's well taken.
There was something else I wanted to say a few moments earlier to this last discussion, as far as what protections there are and the degree to which cannabis laws change. And as Andrew said, they don't appear to change to him much. Well, if you possess cannabis and you don't have the cannabis card, then you still are violating the Cannabis Control Act. If you have a card, you must have that card on you if you are possessing or using medical cannabis. And incidentally, the law does contain a set of rules for where you may not use or possess cannabis. The important thing is you cannot use it in a public place. A public place is described as any place where a person could reasonably expect to be observed by others. That doesn't include a private residence, and it doesn't include a healthcare facility. And that's going to bring a whole new slew of issues regarding the proper use in healthcare facilities. Do any of the attorneys here want to speak about that?
I would say that the real issue there is going to be in healthcare facilities, and it's going to affect modality. There are just certain methods of injecting cannabis that aren't going to be acceptable in the hospital and clinic environment, even though they don't count as public places. And so you're going to run into rulemaking and requests that you limit your ingestion to vaping or some such. You're going to see a whole series of sort of internal regulations adopted by caregivers, and you can't blame them. No matter how benevolent it might be, they don't want their people with inhalant allergies to be dealing with fugitive smoke. So there's going to be some restrictions, but it's not absolutely barred like it would be in like an L station in Chicago.
Yes?
I wanted to ask if there are already penalties enacted, misuse by patients, caregivers, especially where there's criminal penalties, civil penalties, or anything.
Yeah, any use that is not compliant with this law is a violation.
Certainly a violation of this law. If someone has it, is it out? Is there anything?
Sure, that would be a violation of this law, which would result in losing your card and criminal prosecution under the Cannabis Control Act. Losing your immunity, yeah. So incidentally, in the healthcare facility, smoking cannabis is obviously not going to be allowed. Vaporizing is a somewhat healthier alternative, but there are even better healthy alternatives for cannabis medicine. At this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to a local pharmacist who is going to give us a presentation about the various forms of cannabis medicine, and the conditions for which they may be effective.
Thank you, Brad. I have some slides I'd like to show you. I'm Jacqueline Brown. I was a clinical pharmacist at Blessing Hospital for 3.5 years in the emergency department, and have since taken an opportunity in management out of the state. But to let you know, I've given this presentation a couple of times at Blessing Hospital, and they're being proactive at understanding the laws. Okay, slideshow. Okay, so I'm going to start with a patient case, and this is just the outline of about 30-minute presentation. I'd like some audience participation, so would you raise your hand if you know someone who consumes marijuana for medicinal purposes? Okay, quite a few of you. How about for recreational purposes? Even more, definitely. I believe the most common reason people seek out marijuana is to, 1, relieve pain. Anyone for pain? A couple of you. 2, to improve symptoms of nausea and vomiting, like cancer, HIV, a few more. 3, to improve epilepsy. Maybe you've heard of the Sanjay Gupta story with the infant that was having 30 seizures a day. Or 4, to get high, which is usually the most popular answer, but okay. So this is our patient case. It's a 64-year-old woman with metastatic breast cancer to the lungs and spine. She presents to the family medicine clinic for some medication refills. She has insomnia or lack of sleep, loss of appetite, and continuous pain. She's already on strong painkillers, including oxycodone, extended release, 30 milligrams that she takes twice a day, and oxycodone 5 milligrams is needed for breakthrough pain. How many of you would give her a prescription for medical marijuana, assuming it's legal, available, you know how to dose it? Okay, so quite a bit of support. This was an actual New England Journal of Medicine poll that they sent out to all over the world. And 76% of voters were also in favor of giving this case patient medical marijuana to alleviate some of those symptoms and pain and suffering. And surprisingly, we had great representation from North America. At least 50% of the states that had 10 participants or more were in favor, except for Utah, which is no surprise to me, being from Idaho, they're ultra-conservative. Pennsylvania was the polar opposite, they had 96% in favor. So maybe asking yourself, there's already 2 FDA-approved single-molecule pharmaceuticals already on the market, dronabinol, which is Marinol, or Schedule 3, and Nabilone, which is a Schedule 2. Why do we need the plant marijuana when we have these synthetic THC? I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail of what the plant offers beyond just these single molecule pharmaceuticals. There's a liquid extract, nabiximols, or branding Sativex, that's already approved in 8 European countries, Canada and New Zealand. It's currently in phase 3 clinical trials in the United States, and it's a 50-50 mixture of CBD and THC. And it's been very widely successful for muscle spasms and multiple sclerosis, so I think it will be on the market here shortly. But just to be clear, today we're talking about the plant cannabis, which is a Schedule 1, and I won't belabor that point anymore, except for the caveat that Oregon and Connecticut have rescheduled it to a Schedule 2 controlled substance, meaning that it has to come through the pharmacy, and all of that needs a hard copy prescription. You can only get 30 days at a time, etc., which is quite interesting from a pharmacist's perspective. And this slide is just to show that there's hundreds of components in the cannabis plant, and we think that it's really the sum of all the parts that make it synergistic and such an efficacious plant or medicine for pain and other conditions. So your body is already hardwired to, respond to its chemical that it makes internally, anandamide, and then you can see how similar in chemical structure the THC is, which is the psychoactive component for the cannabis. But keep in mind that THC is like a sledgehammer. It's very potent. It has a much longer half-life than your anandamide. So where you might get like a runner's high after a burst of exercise with the anandamide, the THC, it overstimulates those receptors so you get high. And these receptors are all throughout the body, brain, gut, all over. And then along with anandamide, we also have 2-AG, which hits those receptors. And those receptors affect things like motor activity, coordination, short-term memory, thinking, appetite, sedation, and pain, and the immune system. So you can see how those would be some of the targets that we can manipulate. So CBD and THC, we think that they work in combination to, again, bring homeostasis or really balance among the plant's cannabinoids. So CBD actually attenuates or lessens the psychoactive component of THC. And CBD may be the more helpful cannabinoid for the seizures and has some antiemetic or like anti-nausea properties, anti-inflammatory properties. They're also looking into a ton of other targets that cannabis is helpful, including this pain target of the TRPV receptors. If you've ever bought capsaicin over the counter, you know that it depletes substance P and helps pain for arthritis. I think that cannabis may also help in that regard, in that mechanism. So back to the patient case, THC may be the psychoactive component of cannabis, but it's probably the CBD that would be the most helpful in helping with your pain. I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the strains and formulations. There may be other people that are more expert on this topic than I am, but I'll give it a go. So the bud part of the plant has the highest concentration of THC. And this is just a picture of the plant. These trichomes at the bottom, they tell you when the growing cycle is complete and can also indicate whether the plant has a high concentration of THC. The other great thing about the law is that these cultivation centers are going to be highly regulated. There won't be any mold or pesticides or bacteria, so you know you're getting a very high quality medical grade cannabis. There's also going to be 24-hour video surveillance, so it'll be very safe. There's two different strains of the plant, or major strains. There's the sativa and indica, and the sativa primarily affects the mind. It's the more uplifting or euphoric medical marijuana for the daytime. And then the indica is more the nighttime, evening medical marijuana, maybe the more relaxing. There's a lot of resources online too. I found this website and there's almost 800 different strains. So from a patient perspective, once you found your strain, you kind of like hit gold. And a lot of the websites will even tell you the different side effects, what it will relieve, and kind of what to expect. Other patients can go in and leave a review. So there's 3 routes of administration that are mainly used: the lungs, the smoking, vaporization, the gut, and skin. And I guess one of the reasons the lungs are so popular, and smoking is so popular, because it's a quick on, quick off. It works within seconds, really, to relieve some of that pain, and it can last for a couple of hours. So you may have to repeat dosing every 4 hours. 50% of the THC content is delivered through the smoke in the lungs and also through the vaporization. The gut has variable absorption, and every patient is different. It depends on how much you've eaten that day, or if you've eaten anything at all, or even the time of the day. So it may take 30 minutes to start feeling the effects from an edible, like maybe a cookie or brownie or gummy or something, and that effect may last 5 to 8 hours. And so a lot of the side effects that you'll see with the edibles, if you're a new patient, as you take a gummy, you don't feel anything. Take another one, and then four or five gummies later, you're totally paranoid. So this is where the challenge comes in with the pharmacist. And one of the models that has been suggested is that you leave a Saturday open. You cut your cookie into 16 pieces. You take a piece of the cookie, you wait an hour, a good hour, and then you take another piece if you don't feel anything. And then once you start feeling something, that's your dose. There's a lot of therapeutic effectiveness of medical marijuana, including the appetite stimulation, nausea, vomit, pain, epilepsy. There's lots of research looking into migraine relief, lots of good evidence with spinal cord injury and also multiple sclerosis, including some of the debilitating conditions that are listed in the program. This is the registry for Colorado, which is one of the most robust cardholder registries. And as you can see, over 94% of the patients use medical marijuana for pain. So I just wanted to touch on a few clinical trials or some research out there. We know it's very effective for cancer pain. That's kind of a given. But looking in non-cancer pain, chronic treatment of non-cancer pain, that they're potentially going to be on this medication for years and years. For smoked cannabis, there were 4 trials, and all 4 of those trials found a positive effect in improving neuropathic pain versus placebo with no serious side effects. And then, as you can see, most of the trials, it's about 70% positive, 30% negative for being effective for non-cancer pain. We know that cannabinoids have a role in the treatment of refractory pain, especially neuropathic pain, especially when you maybe maxed out your opioids or prescription painkillers. And the study limitations are that it's very difficult to blind patients. You pretty much know if you're getting the marijuana or not. Short duration, small numbers enrolled. So we really need the federal government to reschedule this so it can be studied more appropriately. Of course, there's always side effects with every medication, and like I said, more research is needed. Common side effects would be blood pressure changes, fast heart rate, and flushing. Can increase the median incidence of heart attack the first hour after smoking. Dry mouth, dry eyes, headache, euphoria, which may be wanted in some instances, dizziness, anxiety, or paranoia, and the elderly may be much more sensitive to these side effects. It's definitely not recommended in pregnancy and breastfeeding, and there's solid evidence that showed low birth weight reported when used chronically during pregnancy, and withdrawal symptoms of jitteriness, tremulousness, crying, etc., and it is secreted in the breast milk. We know that it interacts with opioids and benzodiazepines to have additive effects. It may also increase your bleeding if you take it with warfarin. It can increase your levels of tricyclic antidepressants, including tachycardia or fast heart rate, and also interferes with the protease inhibitors. It's really important that you let your healthcare provider know if you have marijuana 72 hours on board before your surgery. There's case reports of different complications with patients that have marijuana on board. And just some of the pros, we know that it treats a variety of conditions, especially those refractory to traditional, conventional medication. There's so many therapeutically beneficial cannabinoids. It's safe. There's no activity on the brainstem, so it won't stop your breathing like opioids and alcohol. Patients can self-titrate, and there may be financial benefit that's kind of been belabored. Cons, we lack well-designed clinical trials. Sometimes it's hard to measure those ingredients. Of course, adverse health effects when smoked, potential addiction burden, and financial burden because this is a cash business and very expensive. So some parting thoughts. Healthcare providers are best equipped to ensure patient safety by providing an open environment to talk about marijuana use, and this is really the hospital's stance too. They want to help their patients, and they need to know who is on medical marijuana. Significant research gaps cannot be adequately studied without rescheduling marijuana, and that was the end. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. If anyone enjoyed that presentation, incidentally, there are copies of it at the table back there. Sir, do you have a question?
The question was, why didn't I mention glaucoma for medical marijuana? And the research is not really robust. It does lower intraocular pressure, but it's not promoted from the Glaucoma Society of America or some of those other big medical organizations that you'd like to see their support before it becomes mainstream treatment. I believe that we have some quality pharmaceutical drops that best treats glaucoma over medical marijuana at this point. Maybe if it's studied further, that was why I didn't list it.
Use of a marijuana when smoked, as long as you're smoking, it does reduce the pressure way down. He claims, his research organization he researches with, that the second you put it out, the pressure goes right straight back up. And it is not THC that reduces the pressure, and they can't figure out what it is in that marijuana plant, but they're trying to find out. But it does lower the pressure immediately. But the second you put it out, the pressure goes right back up.
Are you aware of this group of individual acuity when you do that?
Yes.
Great question, thank you.
Glaucoma
Right.
So in your plans, I don't know exactly, but are there numbers?
Brad, maybe you can help me. I've heard 17,000. Did I throw that out from something that we talked about? Or?
I don't think there's numbers out there. I don't believe there are easy, accurate, hard numbers out there yet. There may be methods for coming up with those numbers, but you're absolutely right. We have no idea. That's partly what this pilot program is about. It's an experiment to determine what are the costs and benefits of a regulated model, but also what can we find out about the potential size of the market and then adjust from there. We really are wandering in the dark. Some of those methods for determining it, I believe they estimate that in Colorado, when it was medical only, you had about 2% of the population. However, that was a different regulatory format because they had an inexhaustive list of conditions. A doctor could prescribe it for anything, whereas in Illinois we have this finite list. So if you assume that in Colorado you're looking at about 2% of the population, I think you would have to cut that maybe in half in Illinois.
So that makes sense, 94%.
Well, we have fibromyalgia here in Illinois. We have non-medical professionals like
One of the interesting things I'm aware of is after the passage of Amendment 64 in Colorado, which allowed for recreational sales, if you talk to some of the business owners out there, you'll find that a lot of them who began in the medical industry are taking the transition very slowly, if at all. Part of the reason is that I believe the number of card-carrying patients in Colorado has actually doubled to about roughly, Joe, you might want to fact check me on this, but I believe there's roughly 200,000 patients in Colorado right now. I think I saw a hand back in the back of the audience. No?
Will there be a dispensary located in Quincy, Illinois, or will the person have to go all the way to Chicago or Springfield? And secondly, if you're an Illinois resident and you have a Missouri physician, would you be able to prescribe the Illinois patient with the American North?
No, it must be an Illinois physician who prescribes it. And it must be an Illinois patient. There can be a dispensary in this entire state police district. It's not necessarily going to be in Quincy. If you'll check the map back by the table, I've drawn the state police districts on that map. State police districts are extremely important under this law because each state police district gets one cultivation center. The cultivation center is the place where you grow cannabis plants and you turn it into medicine. The dispensary is simply the place where you receive cannabis medicine from the cultivation center and you sell it to registered patients. The magic number for dispensaries is 60. The law said that they should be distributed so that every patient has reasonable proximity and access to one. The Department of Financial and Professional Regulations has determined that means 40 of the dispensaries should go to Chicago and the surrounding region, whereas the rest of the state gets just 20 of them. So our region just gets 20. So it's entirely possible that some patient will have to travel 30 miles or more to get to a dispensary. So there is, it's harder for patients in the rural areas, and there's less entrepreneurial opportunity for us here also. Joe? I'm sorry? No. And in fact, a patient can purchase medicine from only one of the dispensaries. But a cultivation center can ship its product to all of the dispensaries.
My question is, I know if you have a car, you're able to have your medicine at home and stuff, but if you're going to drive so far to get it and you're traveling home with it, I mean, is that...
Yeah, you're legal. You can you can legally possess it as long as you have that card on you. And you keep it in the sealed, tamper-proof, child-proof container as long as you haven't opened it and there's no reason to suspect that you took your medicine and then got in the car. You're not violating the Cannabis Control Act. And this is a perfect segue to turn things over to Andrew.
In answer to your question, to elaborate a little more on it, if you have to drive to get it, that's fine, but you better keep it in that container because if you do it on the way back and you get stopped, that's a DUI. That's the other thing with this law. It doesn't change the DUI aspects of it at all. Driving under the influence. In Illinois, as most of you know, we have two different types of DUI laws. One is alcohol, which you can presumably be up to 0.07, 08 is the limit. So you can still drink and drive. With cannabis and other controlled substances, it's it's a zero tolerance. So if you have it in your system and the officer has probable cause to stop you and they give you a draw test either through urine or blood, and right now they're doing search warrants through internet and emails and fax machines. You may find yourself in a hospital giving urine or blood, and the card doesn't get you off the hook for that either.
Well, what I mean by that is, they gotta suspect that you are high, right?
Well, now you're talking about probable cause.
Well, what I'm saying is...
No, they don't have to suspect that you're high.
You get it in the package, you get it. If that package ain't messed with, you get pulled over and that package ain't messed with, they ain't gonna just take you to the hospital and draw your blood because you have smoked before.
Oh yeah. They sure can. It happens every day here in Adams County. If you've been in an accident, if you're driving erratically, if you've given them some reasonable suspicion that you're under the influence of something, they can do that. Whether your package is open or not. If your package is open, I think you're probably giving them a blank check.
Sure. Like I'm saying, if anybody was using this, and you've been doing it for a year or 2 years, however long so far on this thing, it's going to stay in your blood.
That's right.
You know what I mean? So why wouldn't they send it to your house then if they're going to give you a chance to, hook you up with a felony or a crime because you got to drive 30 miles to get it?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, but there is a problem with the law in Illinois as it is currently written because of zero tolerance. what we're seeing with the local testing is that it stays in your system about 30 days. So presumably 2 weeks ago, you could have legally ingested. Then you get stopped, you're in a car accident, they have probable cause. It's a problem and it's going to have to be addressed. I won't comment on that. Yes, sir. Hope so. Yeah.
On the subject of where these dispensaries, these cultivation centers, how is this going to play into zoning and these issues? As far as proximity to schools, perhaps, care centers, things like that.
But the law's already provided some relief for certain locations that it has to be this far from a school and this far from certain other facilities. But there is no immunity for the dispensaries from zoning. The property laws of the state of Illinois still apply. And in fact, our city's zoning administrator was here earlier. He left before he could hear your question. But no, we're gonna have property control issues. But it's a lawful use, and it will probably get put in probably an M-class business. Not a strip mall, but some kind of use where there's other businesses, and it'll at least here it'll get zoned. If somebody wants to put it here, they'll find a place to put it. But you're right, you're going to have to jump through those hoops. Yeah.
The law already does say some things about zoning. The cultivation center must be 2,500 feet outside of any residential zone. So it must be 2,500 feet from the nearest residential zone, plus 2,500 feet from schools and childcare. For the dispensary, you must simply be outside the residential zone, but then you must also be 1,000 feet from schools and childcare. And Tony, I have a question for you. To what degree do you think this gives the local government some power? So how realistic is it for the local government to accommodate a business if they look at their zoning map and there's a potential property that they would like used for this purpose or they would not like to be used for their purpose? How realistic is it for them to be able to change their map?
About 10 years ago, Illinois zoning and land use law changed comprehensively, and it's almost a due process procedure now. And the burden, as soon as you show that you've got a decent piece of property for use, the burden virtually reverses to the city to show that they had something beyond just a mere rational basis to deny it. That's why I was so certain when I answered your question earlier that you find an appropriate use. They may put some conditions. They may ask for certain kinds of windows or certain assurances of security. You know, there may be a special use permit issued, but there will be places who will arbitrarily deny it. But it's much harder in Illinois in the last 10 years to justify the denial of an otherwise lawful use. And of course, some places you'll see sort of an irrational refusal. But I don't think operators are going to have that big a problem in most home rule cities finding a place to operate a dispensary.
Are dispensaries always separate from a pharmacy, or can an established pharmacy serve as a medicinal cannabis dispensary?
I'm going to turn that one over to Brad. I have an opinion, but he's the one that studied the act specifically.
I don't believe it's intended that the dispensary be a pharmacy. I think it's intended there be some level of separation. Incidentally, it's going to be a very competitive process for these businesses. You're allowed only one cultivation center and only one dispensary for some of these districts, and you're going to have a lot of very competent entrepreneurs putting together the plans. It's a pharmacist and related professionals have very valuable expertise to bring to the table, but it doesn't seem plausible that Walgreens or CVS is going to expand into this entirely. Joe? Sure, that's a very good point. He said that pharmacy is regulated by the DEA and might lose their controlled substances license were they to engage in this sort of venture. Was there a question on this side?
Yeah, I have a couple different questions. So what you're saying is that I have to choose.
You got to speak up, ma'am.
So what you're saying is that I have to choose between the narcotics that I'm currently taking and if I, like he said, I had taken medicine 2 weeks ago for a period of a month and it still shows up in my system, I'm not allowed to drive.
Yeah, that word past zoning. I'm not a doctor, ma'am, and none of us, and I think that's a question you have to ask your physician. I can tell you from personal experience, my son was on about every type of drug you could possibly imagine, prescribed by every doctor that he ever saw. None of them worked. They didn't come close. They ruined his personality, and if you ask him, they ruined his life. He went to the cannabis as a last-ditch resort, and it hasn't made things perfect, but it's made him able to at least live his life. So basically, I shouldn't say this, I've got a drawer at home of prescription medications that are just laying there because he either won't take them or they didn't do him any good, whereas he's out in Colorado now and it's working for him. And that's not to say it's going to work for you or anybody else, but it is certainly helping him.
What I'm trying to say is, as far as the driving though, because I have rheumatoid arthritis and I have fibromyalgia, it's not going to go away. So, I mean, we're talking, I will have to take medicine for the rest of my life.
You're asking us medical questions, ma'am. I don't think anybody up here wants to. Maybe the pharmacist.
As far as the zero tolerance, as far as driving.
Yes, I think you'd be prudent to not drive if you're going to use medical marijuana.
Well, that's what you'd have to be addressed. That's the zero tolerance issue that I talk about.
Well, I wanted to throw in a comment here. So I've seen this process kind of play out in a couple of different places. Like you said, this is an issue that the legislature at some point will have to address. Now, in some places, they have proposed that the DUI laws be regulated according to a blood limit. So they'll test your blood. I've seen limits as low as 0.5 or 0.05 nanograms of THC metabolites is the threshold for being under the influence. Now, is that scientifically valid? Probably not. Are there public health risks or safety risks that need to be assessed? Sure. Now, one of the important things is that if you look at the actual data on highway fatalities and accidents, you see a nationwide trend going down. Part of that is that now we have safer vehicles, airbags, stuff that we didn't have 10, 15, 20 years ago. Automobile design is better, and highway design is better, and we have law enforcement that has taken a lot of enforcement things in good ways, and so across the board you see around the nation accidents rates going down. Now, if you look at the medical marijuana states as opposed to the non-medical marijuana states, and you look at or around the time of the implementation of that law, you see some surprising things show up in the data. Now, there's a paper out there that was done by 2 University of Denver economists. And what they found was in medical marijuana states, uniquely, you saw reductions in fatalities and accidents, and you saw those reductions in sometimes in very particular populations. For instance, if you look at the data on accidents and fatalities for the age demographic of men who are between 20 and 29, you'll see in medical marijuana states or in legal states, you'll see that that demographic begins getting into fewer accidents or experiences fewer driving fatalities. Part of the reason there that these economists hypothesize is that in places where you can make that safer choice, people do make that safer choice. Instead of going out to the bars and drinking and driving, you might go out and get a six-pack, go back home, smoke a joint, you know, and hang out. There's another insight that I wanted to share. My colleague, Tony Ryan, he is a 36-year sergeant or police officer with the Denver Police Department. You know, and what he said, and I saw him as he went around Colorado, stumping for Amendment 64. When he retired, he became an advocate for a group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. His line was, you know, you don't see stone drivers or people who've used marijuana making risky or irrational decisions like people who have consumed alcohol. You know, you see, you know, they're not the people blowing past the stop sign or the stoplight. They're the people who, you know, slow down 50 yards ahead and sneak up on it. So, you know, these are all issues that you guys need to be educated on. And if the law here establishes that zero tolerance policy, that if you have THC metabolites in your system, regardless of when you used it or any functional test of impairment, then that's an issue that the legislature needs to understand and move past. So.
I'm still kind of confused. I don't quite understand. I don't feel like you answered my question.
Okay, so I think the consensus here is that, yes.
If I've been smoking or whatever for the past 3 weeks, and I want to get in the car and drive tomorrow,
You probably should arrest me.
I don't want to do anything that's
Is that they will give you blood tests and it's up to the officer's discretion whether that things that truly cause your accident. With alcohol, just a specific level that you measure. Your above this level, it's taken away when it comes to pain medicine as well as cannabis. Pain can test positive, but it doesn't indicate the amount you have in your system. They think that you're stoned off your pain medicine, they can say that that's going to keep causing your accident. Or whatever reason they pull you.
If you take the risk of driving, it's very unlikely that you're going to get pulled over and someone's going to draw your blood on the side of the highway just for driving. But you have taken marijuana. You did.
I'm worried about being like tomorrow. I won't be, you know, I wouldn't be.
Ma'am.
By law, if you're a law-abiding citizen,
The zero tolerance policy puts you at risk. If you get behind the wheel and you have marijuana in your system from 1 month ago, you risk a DUI.
He's absolutely correct. It has nothing to do with being under the influence. That's what the law says, driving under the influence. It has nothing to do with being under the influence. You can be the best driver in the world. But if you have it in your system, in Illinois, it's currently, with all controlled substances, it's zero tolerance. If it's there, you lose. We see that every day here in Adams County. Is it right? Probably not. But it's the law. And it's going to have to be addressed.
Between this and this. So basically, I have to either choose this or this.
Don't drive. Have somebody else drive you. That's the easy answer. It's You're making more out of this than it is. You can't have it in your system, period.
You know, if you're not impaired, you're probably not going to get pulled over for committing any crime. And if you don't have any cannabis on you, there's no reason for the officer to speculate that whatever you did wrong was a result of the cannabis. Maybe you do get arrested for it. What's going to happen next is going to go to court, and the lawyer will demonstrate the fact that you are a card holder. You take cannabis every day, but the test doesn't necessarily prove that you took cannabis on that day. I think this is going to be a big problem for the courts going forward, as a matter of fact.
And the other question I have is over insurance.
Oh.
Or is it certainly going to be just...
Insurance in what regard? Insurance as, will your medical insurance cover the cost of your cannabis medicine?
Yeah.
No, not initially. Insurance providers are not required to, and I doubt that they will take the initiative to, but things move in baby steps. Maybe in 10 years, this will be treated the same way as other controlled substances, but we're not there right now.
Because like with one of the things, I'm on 15 medicines just in the morning. One of my medicines that I take is a as the medicine for migraines, 10 of my pills cost the state like $430. You would think they would be more interested in pursuing this opposed to that or the side effects that cause that, and where I have to go to doctors and hospitals for the rest of that also.
Well, there's a lot of moving parts. It's a conversation you want to have with your doctor, and this is the exact conversation. Is cannabis a alternative that might be safer or less safe, more or less expensive, a better or not a better fit for you? At this point, it's a scientific question. Were there more questions out there? Yes, sir.
You know what, I read a statistic recently that 60% of Illinois favor 60% of Illinois favor medicinal marijuana. And I think the answer to what this one was talking about is to get different people in the state legislature. And quite frankly, everyone in this room has a stake in getting different people to support changing these laws. I mean, this is ridiculous. This woman is paying whatever she's paying for all these drugs, and now she's got to hire a lawyer as well. It's really important. That's a state legislature issue. You've got to get different senators and House of Representatives that support people in Illinois. It's ridiculous.
Hear, hear. I do believe we are moving forward, though, and this is.
I say that every day, but it doesn't change the fact that that's what I'm stuck.
Right. Look at people going.
We can't keep our governors out of prison. Yes, sir. A dispensary, yes. I understand where you're going. Yeah, each patient is entitled to one registered caregiver, a person who is 21 years of age, can pass the state police background investigation. That person then has the ability to purchase medicine on the patient's behalf and help the patient administer it if they're that disabled. And it's the same registration process. The Department of Public Health handles the registrations for both the patients and the caregivers, and they will be given similar cards, which will be read the same way at the dispensary. Incidentally, there is a maximum amount of medicine that can be purchased. It's 2.5 ounces per every 2 weeks. That's 2.5 ounces of the cannabis buds, or 2.5 ounces as in the pre-mixed weight of the cannabis that goes into making a product, such as a edible cookie or brownie, or a serum, or a tincture, or a concentrate. Yes? That's not on the agenda right now. We are simply in a pilot program, but this pilot program terminates in 4 years, so it will then be on the legislature to do what it will with the information it's gathered over this 4 years. Maybe it makes sense to expand the regulatory framework, or maybe it makes sense to cancel it altogether. And I think it will be important to see what some of the other states are doing in that regard, because it is a matter of economic competition too.
I think once you have an industry here, industry has an economic interest in the community, that will drive legislation towards legalization regardless.
I share that opinion also. Did everyone hear it? That legalization will drive economic opportunity, and these organizations will be a responsible, contributing part of the community, and the community will embrace them. I definitely paraphrase your words a lot. I'm sorry. Well, the crime is being impaired. You're simply going across state lines is not illegal. If you were to carry it with you across state lines, that would be illegal, but
So the other side
Well, it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while. We're going to have 50 different jurisdictions existing in a vacuum, and it necessarily must be that way. It's the federal government that must catch up to fix that problem.
Isn't medical marijuana legal in 23 states now?
I think it's 22 or 23. I'm going to pass it off to Epen on that one. But I mean, it's legal here, but we don't have any legal medicine yet because we're still in the implementation phase. And it is that way in some of the other states. But almost every state, if not every state, has a bill that is progressing through its legislature that will legalize cannabis for medicinal purposes or recreational purposes, or there are some that are even wanting to legalize only an extracted ingredient of it. And I'm going to pass it off to Epen for this.
What's the question?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
I think it's right around 22. I know the District of Columbia just passed a decriminalization law. Yeah, it's right around 22. Yeah, well, again, Michigan has that patient caregiver model. They don't have legal dispensaries. They don't have legal sale. And you see a lot of problems from this unregulated atmosphere in Michigan. For one, you have little to no control or really sympathy from a lot of law enforcement agencies in the state. So there's a lot of people in Michigan who, although they have their, they're appropriately registered, the law enforcement and the prosecution side of things sees so much gray area in the law that a lot of these people still face prosecution. But in Missouri, for instance, the legislature, and one of the recent evolutions that you've seen is the emergence of CBD or CBD hemp-only legislation. And if you're familiar with that, that's dramatically expanded the political opportunities for driving marijuana reform. So CBD is cannabidiol, and in the last 4 years, we've seen in Colorado particularly kind of a organized group of people come together who have serious medical issues, and prominent among these are families who have children with autism or who have severe epileptic disorders. And what they've found is that there's specific cultivated genetics that have low THC content and high CBD content. And what's happened is that there's organizations, Relative Caring is probably the most prominent, that has drafted legislation that would allow, this very narrow, basically epilepsy-only CBD marijuana extract. And that legislation has made some really surprising inroads. You've seen Utah pass it. Tom Corbett, the governor of Pennsylvania, last week signed a CBD-only medical marijuana bill. Although, again, they're saying it's not marijuana, it's hemp. Potato. And Utah, Alabama, Georgia has, Missouri this week also passed a CBD-only bill. It's on Governor Nixon's desk. And that seems to be, while not something that you could call medical marijuana in the sense that, it's so limited, it's dramatically improving the prospects for, breaking through on expanding medical access, and even in terms of making it more politically possible for the legalization discussion. But I mean, who would have thought 5 years ago, 2 years ago, even 4 months ago, that you would see Utah or Alabama consider, or Georgia consider this kind of legislation?
How many more counties are in our growing area, our Illinois state control? I know it's Adams and Hyde. Is there another county in our Illinois control?
Scott's in 20, isn't it? Scott is in district.
Please.
Scott County's in 20. There's 3. The map's in the book. Let me take a quick look, but I'm sure I'm right.
And you said this is a temporary law that's
I'm going to answer your first question while Brad's digesting. Adams, Brown, Pike, Schuyler, and Scott. So if they put it in the sort of population center, it would be in Adams County somewhere. If they put it sort of concentric, I guess it would be on the interstate near Liberty or Berry, you know, just to sort of do my little drawing compass. So that's the district anyway. The interstate goes sort of through the middle of the district. Can I go back to this lady for a minute? I've really been reflecting on what you said about the insurance. A dozen years ago, at a convention of board-certified neurologists in the United States, they all affirmed that there was no such thing as fibromyalgia, that a disease or condition that's diagnosed by identifying the absence of any indicators of any other disease or condition is not a disease, so we're not recognizing it. Now, somebody says 4% of the female population in the United States are fibromyalgia sufferers. I don't know what the right number is. You know, those days are gone. Identifying fibromyalgia is no longer an issue. Arguing about whether it's a noted disease or condition is no longer an issue. 3 years ago, people over 65, if they wanted a shingle shot, had to pay for it themselves because no insurance would cover it and Medicare wouldn't go near it. Today, just 3 years later, you walk into any Walgreens, any CVS, if you're over 65 and on Medicare, they give you the shingle shot, they bill Medicare, Medicare pays, and you're out the door. So, I don't think that the wheels of medicine and the medical payor system grind quite as slowly as you've been led to believe. I do a lot of employee representation, so I deal with the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. And as a consequence, I have 4 or 5, almost always women, a week in my conference room who are fibromyalgia sufferers. I have gotten to be the world authority on fibromyalgia gait. There's at least 10 women in here who are fibromyalgia sufferers. And what do they tell you when you first go in? They tell you that, you know, narcotics are not a permanent fix for this. Eventually, you will have trouble with the snapback effect, and it won't work. So we'll try you on mild exercise and anti-inflammatories, and maybe some mild psychotropics. And the trouble is, it hurts too bad to do the mild exercise, so everything gets worse. The people who have been on compassionate marijuana in other states have found they've been able to do the mild exercise and they don't need the narcotic. Now, sometimes you have other conditions like CFS that go with fibromyalgia, and that needs a whole different treatment protocol. But when you have the opportunity to use the compassionate marijuana, you may find that some of these other things fade away, and you may find that somebody else is paying for it sooner than you think. I don't mean to single out any medicals of yours, but I wanted to address your questions because I've been reflecting on them since you asked.
Yeah, because I have fibromyalgia, I have rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, I have migraines, I have several of them, you know, different issues. And it's like, then you take the narcotics that they give. Over half of my medicine is for my rheumatoid arthritis. And part of the other half is for side effects that can, you know, cause from the medicine. It's a vicious circle with this medicine. And then I also have dealt with my mom as far as Alzheimer's with the Marinol for her. So I'm also questioning about her information too.
I'm over my head on the Marinol, but I'm familiar with one very specific circumstance where the pot helped and the Marinol did zero. So when they talk about how certain people aren't amenable to that, you got my attention. Somebody had a hand up. Yes, ma'am.
If you're a grower, are you going to have to pay the state of Louisiana to get started?
Yeah, it's a big investment. Brad knows more about that than I do.
You're going to have to pay substantial startup costs, first of all. On top of that, there is, I believe, a $25,000 application fee. Non-refundable. You have to put $2 million in escrow, or else have your board of directors bonded in that amount. And you also have to show liquid assets. Now it is in the amount of $400,000. But that's still subject to change. It was $200,000 in the last draft. There are still comments open on the regulatory system. It's not too late to tell the agencies what you think about those requirements. If you think they're too large or not large enough.
Basically, to open up a cultivation center in Illinois, it's $5 million. To do a dispensary, it's about $2 million.
The gentleman said that basically to do a cultivation center in Illinois, it's going to cost about $5 million, whereas a dispensary will cost about $2 to $3 million. $2 to $3 million for a dispensary is one estimate. $5 million for a cultivation center is an estimate. Yes? Yeah, it's going to be a function of a few different things. Like I told you, those rules are static. One per each cultivation district. One cultivation center for each state police district, and then there's a formula for dispensaries. 40 of them in Chicago region, and then roughly one for each of them throughout the rest of the state. And then think about what's going to be happening in each one of these districts. You'll have maybe 5 applicants for the cultivation center in this district. Yeah. That's the price to play the game. I can't criticize that system. You can't welcome everyone to try to participate, because then it becomes an incredibly burdensome process on the state. You really do need to put some kind of bar in place to make sure that these are very reputable businesses, serious businesses that are competing. We don't want the state to spend months reviewing an excessive amount of applications, because that delays medicine getting into the hands of patients. That's just a risk that has to be taken. If you're serious about it, you'll have faith that you can put together the best plan and win. It's $25,000 is worth, a lot of people are going to find that $25,000 is worth the chance to sit at the table for what could happen after 4 years if this market really takes off. Yes, sir.
As Bradley said, there's 25 applicants for this police district. Now all we support.
That's right.
The highest scoring applicant in this police district will be given the opportunity to start.
The regulations contain a set of criteria for which each of these applicants will be judged by. It's such things as how smart is the location, how secure is the facility, how well has this company demonstrated its ability to grow cannabis and turn it into medicine, how strong is its executive management team. I have to believe it will be done correctly, but at the end of the day, there's one agency that's going to make the decision regarding how strong each business is. Yes?
So somebody who's done this in Colorado and been successful, like this guy here, he's probably going to have a really good chance of getting a growing district here in Illinois.
I highly doubt he can do it by himself. He might try to partner with other people, because it's not a one-person game. It requires an entire team. And that's right. The law definitely requires local support, in the sense that there's those zoning requirements, and I believe that a local community could adjust its zoning map to accommodate or to hinder a plan. But more than that, it lends strength probably to an application to be able to include a letter of support from the local city council or county board. It's possible that the agency may see it that way, but it's not set in law.
Is there any legislation that allows any of this taxpayer money to
Honestly, I'm not sure where the money is going to be allocated. I know that all the monies earned from this system are going to go into a compassionate use of medical cannabis fund, and the law does say something about that fund, but I'm not sure that it's going to go directly to schools all the time. A portion of the money is going to go to educating the community. These departments have to spend money, you know, maybe doing TV commercials, radio commercials, producing publications, holding events like this, sort of thing. I do. I know there's a lot of other questions out there. Please hold on to them. I hope to come back to them later, but a really important issue we need to touch is implications for for employers and employees. Just as we talked about the potential criminal aspect of the law in which someone who's a card holder now can legally possess and use cannabis in some situations. Maybe they fear that their use or possession may be misconstrued. Well, there's a lot of issues in the employment context also, and I'm going to turn it over for Tony to address those.
I am not going to make any parallel between the Lincoln Douglas debates and weed, so we'll move right along from there. I can do this, I can do it in 90 minutes, I can do it in about 3. You are, as a card holder, you are exempt, according to the law, from discrimination in school admission, housing, and employment. If you are of a different national origin or a different sexual preference, or if you're pregnant, or if you're over 40 in Illinois, you're also exempt. But if you belong in one of those latter categories, you have the right to go to the Illinois Department of Human Rights and get your discrimination investigated. If you're discriminated against because you're a card holder, you have the right to scratch your head and wonder where I get to go to get my grievance addressed. As nearly as I can figure, you probably have the right to go to court and bark about it. So right away, you are a lesser protected grade than somebody who's black or somebody who's over 40 or somebody who is gay. Illinois is a very liberal state as far as protecting categories. We protect more categories than any other state except New York in the workplace. Similarly, housing, same thing. You're exempt from discrimination, except there's no machinery for you to have your discrimination investigated. School admission. School admission is a little tricky because if you go to a state school, some of the buildings are not actually owned by the school. They're owned, like if there's a museum on the campus like there is at University of Illinois, that's not owned by the university, that's owned by the Secretary of State. So yes, you can't do your cannabis in a public place anyway, but it's a bit of a confusion. In the workplace, the employer gets to decide, even though you can't be discriminated against, the employer gets to decide whether they think you're impaired, and there's a whole bunch of criteria in the Act about what they can use to determine impairment. And those criteria have almost exclusively one thing in common. They're nebulous. So you can't be discriminated against in the workplace except the criteria that are going to be used to measure your performance in the workplace as a cannabis user are nebulous. And I predict what's going to happen in the workplace, and particularly the workplace for licensed professionals. Oh, by the way, if licensed professional is not subject to any restriction or supervision in the workplace if he works for himself. Raise your hand if you know of a licensed professional who is a licensed MD physician who works for himself in Quincy, Illinois now. You don't know one because there isn't one. There was a plastic surgeon and he left town. There are no more independent physicians. So everybody works for somebody. That means the licensed professionals are going to be subject to closer scrutiny by their fellow licensed professionals. And eventually what's going to happen is somebody's going to see impairment. and they're going to say, well, I'm going to let this person go, and they're going to get sued. And there's going to be a big dispute about whether there's impairment or not in the workplace. And so the employers are going to, and we're going to double right back to Drew's remarks, the employers are going to say, we need some objective criteria. Let's get some objective criteria. You know where the only research on cannabis impairment is being done today as we speak? NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Authority Agency. So eventually, they're going to read NHTSA's analysis. What they're doing is have people drive cars through pylons, shoot guns, and then they're measuring their cannabis content at that time. Now, as I talked to Joe before the meeting, what's being measured, no matter whether we use mass spectrometry or gas chromatography, we're measuring salts. Okay, nobody knows whether these salts cause any kinds of intoxication. Nobody knows when the salts got in your system. All they know is you got these salts. Bang! You weren't too tidy out there shooting that gun, and you got some salts, so there must be a connection. The research, even the NHTSA research, they're going to come up. They're trying to solve Drew's question. Instead of having a prohibited number of 0, they're trying to establish a number that actually equals intoxication. The trouble is, they're testing yesterday's newspaper in these people. So, in the workplace, in my opinion, what you're going to see in 2 or 3 years is places like hospitals and clinics, particularly for nurses, adopting, for card holders, adopting 0.4 or something as a standard. And it's going to have no basis in science, but it's going to be defensible because those are going to be the NHTSA data. So the law says, I told Brad I would truly relate to you what the law says. It says you're not subject to discrimination. So instead of discrimination in the workplace, what you are, particularly in the professional environment, is subject to nebulous. So we're short on time. That's a short 3-minute cynical presentation of where we're going in the workplace. Yes, sir.
Would that be the same for somebody with a school bus driver?
CDL operator can't be a card holder. It's just that simple. There are some prohibitions. Yes. Correct, but what's the prohibited level? You know, if you have a little alprazolam in you and you have a prescription for alprazolam because you got stomach spasms or something, that's not a failed drug test. If you show your card and you have a little metabolite in you, that's not a violation, except what if you're above whatever they think the NHTSA standard stands for? I couldn't hear you.
I can fire every one of my employees because we have a sampling program, and I can fire them and have a team single system if I apply a drug test to everybody because the physician's recommendation is not a prescription.
Can I answer that question?
Sure.
So when you do a drug test in Illinois, you can, as a patient, tell the physician what drugs you're currently on. So before you actually submit it.
That's what I just said.
Oh, okay.
I used alprazolam as an example.
Yeah, so as long as it's not.
That's a prescribed drug.
I understand the distinction you're making. You're talking about a registered or certified drug as contrasted to a prescription drug. I think that part will get fixed. The fixed arbitrary number from NHTSA is the part that I'm worried about. But you make a hell of a point, and in today's law, that's not addressed. You make a good point. Yes, sir. Do I have a medical background? Absolutely not. That's not what it says on my license. I don't have a prescription for that either. only thing I'll say to that, I'm not defending this law or the behavior of the Illinois General Assembly, but you're closer to medicine that'll work for your glaucoma than you were a few months ago.
This medical marijuana used to help people. People that have pain, anything else, the doctor says that it's easy to do. All I hear about is how many millions the states are charging to see if you can grow it. And how many millions they're going to charge you to see if you can sell it. We've got companies like Pfizer and Merck that will get this thing. Other drugs I take, I can go to any other state without my medication. Go to the pharmacy, all I pharmacy back here, they serve the same more have a prescription for that. You give that to me. But now the cost of the man for marijuana. Oh my God, marijuana. Oh, hell, we're trying to get people before they get too much pain.
I don't think you're getting any argument out of this audience. I'm sorry. I think you're doing fine.
I would suggest the law has to look like this. It has to be so paranoid because we are really talking about a dramatic change. It's been 80 years. This has been villainized. So we have to approach it like plutonium. I mean, if you look through this law, we're really regulating it more like plutonium than medicine. But it's an intermediary step. I mean, there are some people who still believe it's inherently evil. Like I said, I feel like this is a perfect fit because we got we got just the right amount of voters to vote for it. This is a democracy. We don't have perfect laws. We don't please everyone all the time. We do as best we can to compromise. And this is the shape of the compromise now, but we're evolving. Law is slow to catch up with people. And we're like 80 years behind right now. But this is a bold step. Yeah.
So I understand, I mean, you get medical marijuana to help you whatever problems you have, like the doctor says, whatever. And I understand that the criminal side of it, as in, if you would sell it or do something like that, I can understand you get in trouble for something like that. But I'm still stuck on why you can't get it mailed to you.
Sure.
And you gotta use it.
Well, think about this. If you knew somebody who was getting it mailed to them every day, you could just step in and kind of take it. I mean, it's a matter of security. We're trying to keep it in the right hands of the right people, so we want them to go and pick it up for themselves.
I understand that too. But like this lady said back here, using it every day, like for medicines, going and picking it up and bringing it back. And if she happens to get pulled over, if she hasn't opened this thing, they decide to check her, give her a ticket. How it's going to cost us to pay you? You go in there and say, hey, they used this medicine, they got a card. They didn't use it today, but they used it yesterday.
I think the court system will adjust to take care of that.
I know they're going to be doing some changes. There's got to be doing some changes. I mean, you got 8% or 0.8 on alcohol, which is probably kills more people than anything in the world, and 0 tolerance on marijuana, which hasn't killed nobody.
First off, your zero tolerance isn't just marijuana, it's all controlled substances. Whether you're talking about hydrocodone, whether you're talking about oxy, whether you're talking about Viagra, that is a controlled substance at zero. That's the law. Do I agree with it? No. But as Tony said, you've got to have a benchmark. You've got to have a standard. Right now, we don't have a standard. The standard is 0. And until somebody decides to change that, I've got drawers full of clients who come in and bitch at me because I only had a little bit in my system, and I get to tell them, guess what? That's a little bit too much.
Any is too much.
Any is too much.
Now, let me address your initial question first. One of the things I do in my practice is I get people's license back after they've been revoked, both professional and driver's licenses. And a bunch of us who are active in that, and the Secretary of State Driver Services Division, went to the legislature with a proposed bill that would change Section A4 and A6 of the DUI law to allow to require the proof of impairment in a card holder. Okay? That legislation did not get to the floor this year. It's probably not going to get to the floor in the veto session. Maybe in early 2015 it'll get there. We were very hopeful because the police and the Secretary of State didn't object to it, but the legislature is afraid of it. So the people who do this every day, people like Drew and me, we have a fix for this if the legislature will just wrap their arms around it. It'll happen. It's just not happening fast enough.
Like, if there was a dispensary here in Quincy, I mean, what about like the buses, you know, taking the bus to go get your medicine?
The city bus?
Stuff like that, I mean, what would be a law on that? I mean, can you carry 2.5 ounces of marijuana on a bus? You know what I'm saying? I mean,
You got your card.
Yeah.
If you got your card, it's lawful possession. It's only illegal if you don't have the card.
Right, I got all that part, but I mean, I'm just saying, you know, the bus ain't gonna take you 30 miles to get it. And if you smoked yesterday, you know, I mean, that just seems like you're out to get here to pay Paul, you know what I mean?
Yeah, we take your point. This lady's been really patient.
I'm guessing that someone will petition to have that added, and the committee will meet twice a year, so I don't know why it didn't make the initial list, but there is research and strong evidence that medical marijuana does alleviate some of that PTSD.
I think there's another reason that it wasn't on the initial list. I'm Vietnam era veteran, actually × 2, and the guys that came back from that with what's now been diagnosed PTSD were also laced weed users. They had a lot of hallucinations, and I don't think anybody wanted to. I mean, that's a fact. Those guys are my friends. I knew them. I served with them. They didn't want to encourage reinsertion into that culture right away. It'll happen as people develop a better understanding, and as we're dealing with the Iraq, Afghanistan veterans. Your point's well taken.
There is in the legislature a bill that would add seizure conditions to this list. So it's entirely possible that the legislature could also add PTSD, but the more likely route is, as Jacqueline explained, someone will petition the Department of Public Health. There's a mechanism in the law that allows the Department of Public Health to add whatever conditions it sees fit, assuming that a patient first petitions to add those conditions. Yes, sir.
If you are a card holder, will you be required to report that to your employer?
It depends what kind of employer you have. If you have something that requires a professional license or a CDL, you'll have to choose between if you're a CDL job, you'll have to choose between your employment and your card. Right now, it's that simple. If you have general employment and you're not going to need to use the compassionate marijuana at work, I don't believe you have a duty to disclose. Just like you don't have a duty to disclose you're taking a psychotropic. It's a parallel situation. But if you have more than just the usual hazards, or you have a CDL or some other kind of safety operator's license, then yeah, you're going to have to tell them. Yes, sir. Okay. I don't cook them or clean them, I just report them, sir. run for the state legislature. You get some clear thinking about things. Yes, ma'am. HIPAA only relates to treaters and contractors for treaters. And employers, they may be providing your insurance or self-insurance. They have one TPA that's assigned to do that, and discussing your condition with that TPA is not a violation of HIPAA. And the other piece of that is that even if there's a HIPAA violation, as you probably already know, there's no freestanding action against somebody for violating HIPAA. It's just a regulatory thing.
I think it's going to be about a year from now. That's a factor of it taking time to enact sound regulations, then having this competitive process where all the various cultivation centers will send in their applications. Then the agency is going to have to spend the time to really evaluate them, score them, and decide the best ones. Only then can you start to build your facility. Only after your facility is built can you actually plant a seed, and only a few months later will you actually have a product. So it's going to be about a year. Incidentally, sir, you mentioned something about confidentiality, and that's an important point. Where it's going to come into effect is at the dispensary and at the Department of Public Health. So the information you submit to the Department of Public Health is confidential. There's no need to share it with anyone else. And the information you share with the dispensary is going to be confidential also, but the dispensaries will be staffed by people who are very knowledgeable about cannabis and cannabis medicine, so that you can feel comfortable going to a dispensary and talking about your unique problems and your other unique tastes and preferences. So, you know, ultimately, you may be a patient who's never smoked anything in your life. You may be nervous about never having been around cannabis ever. You'll want to talk to a knowledgeable expert who understands your condition and the various types of medicine so that they can give you what's appropriate. Jacqueline, would you like to add anything to that?
I have a question for her. Matter of fact,
Go ahead.
you're a medical physician, right?
I'm a pharmacist.
Pharmacist. So are we going to have doctors around here that will, because I mean, as a doctor that I go to, they're not prescribed for narcotics or anything like that, you know, and you said you got to build a relationship with them so they can see, you know, where you're at.
Right. It's on their radar. I'm sure there are plenty of physicians that are out there doing research and people in the industry that are advocating for those patients.
Because the closest one I found on the net has been Jacksonville. That's quite a ways to drive.
Right. I mean, I would start locally with who you already established your primary care. Primary care physicians seem to be most fit.
Right.
in taking
Like my doctor, my primary physician right now, I've already told me they're all me, they're not proving nothing. They're not what we're going. So somebody you're out in the agency that might not open that road no, they may find it a waste of Well, he said he was saying I for like
controlled substances. Yeah.
medicines and stuff like that.
Yeah, the whole team voted against the hearing day when they are resident, and they all decided that they're not going to take the strike of marijuana.
So this is the
I'll take one. Take it.
Right. Yeah. And I think the oncologists, they've already reached out to some of the community. Dr. Smith gave a nice presentation in Blessing Hospital to potential patients. Neurologists are going to be another group that are going to be hit pretty heavily. Yeah, the application's not out yet. The rules aren't final. No, it's going to be a little while.
I want to get off the prescription medication.
I'm way better on that than I am on service anything. I'm so tired of this. It's like those doctors, the doctors that are reasonable, they ain't judgmental, the doctors who got 90 abilities, you know what I'm saying, that look at you and see where your problems are, and tell them, look, man, harassing me, it don't work for me. Listen, I don't like it, you know what I mean? They got bad side effects, we're tracking off of it, this and that. And I smoked marijuana since I was 12 years old, I'm 36 now, and it's always done better for me than anything else, from surgeries to everything, it's better than maintenance, all of it. So I totally agree with it, I just don't know who to talk to about it.
We don't know quite yet either, but I'm sure there's a physician group that will fill that niche. Did you have a question?
So, if you're a patient currently that has a condition, like for instance, a neighbor has Parkinson's, so she has Parkinson's disease, can she receive a prescription from a Illinois physician with a DEA number and have it filled in Colorado, or does she have to go live in Colorado?
Yeah, I don't believe that there is reciprocity, although maybe, if I'm wrong, I'm sure Brad will say so, but I don't believe the Illinois law has reciprocity with other states. Now, Arizona does, and I think that you're beginning to see reciprocity provisions be proposed in other places.
That reciprocity,
Okay, so right now, by overall law, that wouldn't happen here.
You couldn't possess a card in another state and use it in Illinois. Like Illinois' card is just for Illinois, to my knowledge.
So you couldn't transfer one from like North Dakota?
Right. No. You'd have to pay the fee for Illinois, have the bona fide patient-physician relationship established in Illinois for them to accept your application.
That's why I'm asking. I'll let y'all know more about where are you located so we can come and ask you questions later. When it's figured out.
Earlier that medicinally this substance is still a Cat 1 controlled substance in the federal parlance, and so Illinois has been careful that none of our scheme crosses state lines, and actually Colorado's is too. So I think there's a reason, not to thump the beast in the ribs. So it makes sense that right now it's very insular. Who knows? Maybe in 5 years that'll be utterly unnecessary. But right now it's probably safer than the alternative.
Are there any more questions? While we're beginning to thin out, I suggest maybe this is an appropriate point to conclude this session, and I think we'll all go out into the crowd if you have any questions for us, if you'd like to network with us. I think we're all available. I want to sincerely thank you all for coming. Please fill out the surveys. I am interested to know if there are any subjects we didn't touch that you would have liked us to generally let me know your feedback so that I can improve if I do any further programs like this.